August 25, 1944. General George S. Patton's Third Army is a phantom, a steel ghost moving so fast that even Allied headquarters can barely track it. After tearing a hole through the German front, its lead tanks approach the French city of Troy and suddenly grind to a halt. The obstacle is not a panzer division. It's not a minefield. It's a single sheet of paper, a formal letter from the city's French mayor containing an unbelievable request. This bizarre diplomatic standoff was only the first symptom of a much larger crisis, a catastrophic failure that was about to paralyze the entire Allied war machine. That standoff at Troy was the breaking point, forcing Patton into an impossible choice: honor the request of an Allied mayor and sacrifice the momentum that could win the war, or force his way through a city he was meant to liberate. This single episode reveals a much larger crisis. What truly stopped the most aggressive army of World War II? Was it a resurgent German defense? A French mayor's plea? Or was it a fatal, self-inflicted wound deep within the Allied war machine itself? To find the answer, we must first understand the invisible war being fought far behind the front lines, a war not for territory, but for fuel. By late August 1944, the Allied armies were victims of their own spectacular success. The breakout from the Normandy beachheads, codenamed Operation Cobra, had shattered the German 7th Army. Now, Allied columns were racing across France, advancing so quickly that their supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. An armored division on the attack could burn through 80,000 gallons of gasoline in a single day, and the nearest major supply port, Cherbourg, was hundreds of miles behind them. The infrastructure of France, its railways and bridges, had been systematically destroyed, ironically, by Allied bombers just weeks before. The advance was threatening to starve itself. Out of this desperation, a logistical miracle was born: the Red Ball Express. On August 25th, the same day Patton's army neared Troy, the Allies launched one of the most ambitious trucking operations in history. Nearly 6,000 trucks, driven primarily by African American soldiers in segregated units, began running a non-stop 24/7 loop from the coast to the front. Major highways were closed to all other traffic, creating a one-way Red Ball highway to the east, and another one back west for the empties. Drivers were pushed to the absolute limit, some staying behind the wheel for over 40 hours straight. But even this monumental effort wasn't enough. It could never keep pace with the thirst of two massive army groups advancing at full speed. This shortfall turned every gallon of fuel into a strategic weapon, and it ignited a bitter rivalry at the very top of the Allied command. On one side was the British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Cautious, methodical, and famously arrogant, he argued for a single thrust strategy. He wanted to concentrate all available supplies, especially fuel, into his 21st Army Group for a single, overwhelming armored attack, a narrow, 40-mile-wide front that would punch directly into Germany's industrial heartland and, he believed, end the war by Christmas. On the other side was America's General George S. Patton. Aggressive, impulsive, and a master of momentum, he championed a broad front advance. Patton believed that halting any part of the line would give the Germans a chance to regroup. The only way to win, he argued, was to attack everywhere, relentlessly, keeping the enemy off balance and preventing them from concentrating their defenses against a single Allied spearhead. Caught between these two clashing egos and their competing strategies was the Supreme Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower. He didn't have enough fuel to fully support both Montgomery's rapier and Patton's broadsword. He had to make a choice that would anoint one general, sideline the other, and gamble the outcome of the war on a single strategic bet. This high-level crisis of maps and memos was about to become a very concrete reality on the battlefield. For the tankers and infantrymen of the Third Army, The first sign of trouble wasn't an enemy shell, but the sputtering cough of a dying engine. By August 28th, the sputtering engines fell silent. All across the front, the armored spearheads of the Third Army began to coast to a stop, not under fire, but on fumes. Sherman tanks, the engines of the Blitzkrieg, were now just 30-ton steel roadblocks parked along French country lanes. For the first time, combat reports from Patton's G4 logistics staff began measuring progress, not in miles gained, but in a new, desperate metric, gallons consumed per mile. The most feared mobile army in Europe, deep in hostile territory, was now dangerously static, a fixed target for an enemy it had just shattered. In his headquarters, General Patton was incandescent with rage. This wasn't a logistical bottleneck to him, it was a betrayal. He saw the invisible hand of his British rival, Field Marshal Montgomery, in every empty fuel can. In his private diary, Patton vented his fury, convinced he was being deliberately sabotaged by the high command. He wrote of a nefarious plan to halt his advance, believing Eisenhower's staff was intentionally diverting his fuel north to support Montgomery's single, cautious thrust. To Patton, victory was being stolen from his grasp, not by German panzers, but by Allied politics. His army was paralyzed. His career-defining offensive was bleeding momentum by the hour, and his paranoia was escalating. It was at this exact moment of maximum frustration, with his divisions running dry and his patience exhausted, that a frantic radio message came in from the 4th Armored Division. They had reached the outskirts of a city named Troy and had run into a problem, unlike any they had ever faced. The problem was the Seine River. To continue the race eastward, the Third Army had to cross it, and the city of Troy, a provincial capital with a history stretching back to the Romans, held the last major intact bridges in the sector. For the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division, arriving on August 25th, the mission was brutally simple: take the city, seize the bridges. The division's Combat Command A, under Colonel Bruce Clark, began preparing for a costly house-to-house assault. Their intelligence estimated a German garrison of a few thousand defenders. A fight was inevitable. The only questions were how long it would take and how many lives and gallons of fuel it would cost. But just as the American spearhead was coiling to strike, a lone figure emerged from the city's outskirts, waving a white flag. He was a member of the French forces of the interior, the Resistance. He carried not a demand for surrender, but a formal diplomatic letter. The existence and contents of this letter are not the stuff of legend. They are documented in the U.S. Army's official after-action reports. It was from the mayor of Troyes and the local FFI commander, a man known only by his code name Montcalm. The message was stunning. They were in the final stages of secret negotiations for the complete and peaceful surrender of the entire German garrison. The German commander was willing to lay down his arms, but only under specific conditions to avoid a chaotic battle with partisans. The letter was an urgent plea to the Americans: do not attack. A premature assault would shatter the fragile truce. The German commander, his honor at stake, would be forced to fight. The result would be the destruction of a historic city and the death of thousands of French civilians. The Americans were being asked to halt their war, to wait on the sidelines, while their allies negotiated with their enemy. To understand this bizarre request, we have to look at the situation from the German perspective. The commander in Troyes was Generalleutnant Botho Elster. He was not a fanatical Nazi ideologue. He was a career officer facing an impossible reality. His command of roughly 7,000 troops was a garrison in name only. It was a chaotic collection of rear echelon personnel, clerks, supply troops, and wounded soldiers swept up in the disorganized retreat across France. They were cut off, hundreds of miles from the new German front, with no heavy artillery, no air cover, and no hope of relief. For Elster, a fight to the death was not a glorious last stand. It was pointless suicide. His primary duty, as he saw it, was to his men. Surrendering to the Americans was one thing, but the prospect of being overrun by French partisans, whom German doctrine considered illegal combatants not protected by the rules of war, was a terrifying one. A negotiated surrender, brokered by the French resistance and finalized by the regular American army, was his only logical path. It would save the lives of his men, prevent the destruction of the city, and allow him to capitulate with a semblance of military order and honor. He wasn't trying to win, he was trying to lose in the least catastrophic way possible. The message was relayed up the chain of command, landing on General Patton's desk at the moment of his peak frustration over the fuel shortages. He was faced with a tactical dilemma that was also a test of his character. Option A, attack. This was the Patton of legend: force a way through, crush the garrison, and take the bridges. But the cost was immense. A street battle would burn thousands of gallons of gasoline that his army desperately needed for the breakout after Troyes. It would consume days, killing the very momentum he lived for. It would cost American lives for a city that was a gateway, not the destination. And if the Germans blew the bridges in the fighting, the entire bloody affair would be for nothing. Then there was option B, bypass. This was the cold, pragmatic choice. Go around the city. This would save fuel, save time, and save lives. It avoided a messy urban fight and the political fallout of destroying a French city during its liberation. But it meant trusting the French resistance. It meant showing patience. It meant leaving an enemy force, however weak, sitting on his army's main supply line. For a general whose entire philosophy was attack, attack, and then attack again, this was an unnatural act. Against every one of his aggressive instincts, Patton the pragmatist overruled Patton the warrior. He made the cold, logical calculation. The prize wasn't Troyes. The prize was Germany. He issued the order. The main armored columns of the 4th Armored Division were to immediately disengage, swing north, and find another crossing over the Seine, leaving Troyes behind. He tasked a smaller, separate, infantry-heavy force to simply contain the city, to act as a placeholder and see if the French mayor's incredible gamble would pay off. Patton had turned a roadblock into an opportunity, conserving his dwindling strength for the decisive push. He had just made a brilliant, resource-conscious tactical decision. But while he was managing this crisis on the ground, a final, irreversible judgment was being passed down miles away at the highest levels of Allied command. A decision that would render his careful conservation of fuel almost meaningless. But Patton's brilliant tactical decision was already being rendered meaningless. The fate of his army was now being sealed hundreds of miles from the front in the sterile quiet of Supreme Headquarters. The brutal, simple math of logistics had finally caught up to strategy. The Allied supply system could support one major thrust into Germany, not two. In a series of tense, late August staff meetings, General Eisenhower was at the center of the storm. He had to choose. On one side, Field Marshal Montgomery's plan for a narrow, rapier-like strike in the north. On the other, the broad front advance championed by Patton and General Omar Bradley. After agonizing debate, the Supreme Commander made his fateful decision. He would bet on Montgomery. Logistical priority, especially fuel, would be diverted to the 21st Army Group for a daring gamble to seize the bridges over the Rhine, the plan that would become Operation Market Garden. With that, the verdict was in. For Patton's Third Army, the broad front advance was officially over, not by German action, but by Allied command. The order was given, the fuel was diverted, and on the last day of August 1944, the consequence of that decision fell like a guillotine. Near the Meuse River, the advance of the U.S. Third Army officially ceased. The sputtering engines had finally gone quiet. For miles, the steel columns of the most feared mobile force in Europe stood motionless along the roads of France. Sherman tanks, tank destroyers, and 2.5-ton trucks sat idle, their fuel gauges on empty, their crews waiting for an order that could not be followed. The blitzkrieg had been stopped, not by a panzer army, but by an empty fuel can. In his field headquarters, General Patton was a man besieged by his own command. This halt was not a tactical pause. To him, it was a strategic catastrophe. That night, he confided his raw, unfiltered fury to his diary. He wrote that stopping his victorious army when the German defenses were in a state of total collapse was the most momentous error of the war. He was utterly convinced that if he had been allowed just 400,000 more gallons of gasoline, he could have broken through the Siegfried Line and been in Germany in 2 days, ending the war. This was the moment one of the great what-ifs of World War II was born, a moment of deafening silence on the battlefield where a historic opportunity was perceived to have been lost forever. The Third Army was stopped cold, but what became of the city that Patton had chosen to spare? 2 days after Patton's armor bypassed the city, the French mayor's gamble paid off. On August 27th, the German garrison of Troyes surrendered peacefully to the small American screening force and the French resistance. Patton's decision was a tactical masterstroke. He had saved American lives, preserved a historic city, and conserved precious time and fuel. But this small, brilliant victory was instantly swallowed by a larger, unmovable reality. The strategic halt forced upon the Third Army gave the Germans the one thing they needed more than panzers: time. Time to rush reinforcements to their western border. Time to man the concrete teeth of the Siegfried Line. And time to reorganize their shattered armies into a coherent defense. This reset led directly to the brutal, grinding battles of that fall and winter, the hell of the Hurtgen Forest, and the shocking counteroffensive that became the Battle of the Bulge. So, what truly stopped Patton? It wasn't the mayor of Troy. He was stopped by the cold physics of logistics and a deliberate strategic choice made by his own supreme commander. The diplomatic drama at Troy was never the cause of the halt. It was merely a symptom, the first visible crack in a supply line stretched past its breaking point. It was a lesson written in steel and silence on the roads of France. In the final race to Berlin, the most decisive weapon wasn't the tank that fired the shell or the plane that dropped the bomb. It was the humble 5-gallon jerry can, and for a critical moment, it was empty.